September 11th, 2001, dawned across the eastern United States with the kind of crisp, brilliant blue sky that signals the end of summer and, the gentle arrival of autumn. In New York City, the day began with its usual relentless energy. Commuters bustled through the subways and onto the streets, grabbing their morning coffee on the way to offices, with many heading towards the iconic Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, those two shimmering pillars that really defined the lower Manhattan skyline. Children were just settling into their classrooms, and across the nation, millions were beginning their daily routines, completely unaware that the very fabric of their world was about to be, irrevocably torn apart. It was a morning steeped in the ordinary, a canvas of normalcy upon which an unimaginable horror would soon be painted. Across the country, the day promised routine and predictability. In Washington, D.C., government workers were making their way to the Pentagon, the sprawling headquarters of the nation's defense. At airports in Boston, Newark, and Washington, passengers were boarding their flights, their minds on business meetings, family visits, or maybe just long-awaited vacations. They went through the familiar rituals of air travel, stowing their carry-on luggage and settling into their seats, perhaps with a newspaper or a book. On 4 of these flights, however, a sinister plot was already in motion. 19 men, operating with cold precision, were preparing to turn these ordinary commercial airliners into weapons of mass destruction, forever shattering the illusion of safety that had long defined American life. The morning of September 11th was, in its first hours, a continuation of the post-Cold War era, a time when America felt secure within its borders, with its primary adversaries seemingly vanquished. The dominant concerns were economic and domestic. The threat of large-scale international terrorism on U.S. soil felt distant, almost abstract. The World Trade Center had been attacked before, in 1993, but that event had not fundamentally altered the nation's sense of invulnerability. On this particular Tuesday, the news cycles were filled with typical stories. The stock market was preparing to open, and the nation was at peace. This profound sense of calm, this quiet confidence in the day ahead, would soon become one of the most poignant and painful memories of all. For those who would later become the first responders, the day also started with the familiar rhythm of a shift change. Firefighters in New York City checked their equipment, police officers prepared for their patrols, and paramedics readied their ambulances for the calls that would inevitably come. They were professionals trained for emergencies, but nothing could have prepared them for the scale of the catastrophe that was about to unfold. Their morning routines, like those of millions of others, were a final, fleeting moment of a world that was about to disappear forever. The sky was clear, the air was cool, and the future seemed as solid and dependable as the 2 towers that reached proudly into the morning light. At 8:46 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, the ordinary rhythm of New York City was violently interrupted. American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767 that had departed from Boston's Logan Airport, slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The impact, between the 93rd and 99th floors, created a horrific gaping hole in the skyscraper's facade, unleashing a plume of black smoke and fire. On the streets below, witnesses looked up in confusion and disbelief. Was it a terrible accident? A small private plane gone astray? The initial reports on news channels were frantic and uncertain, struggling to make sense of an image that was simply incomprehensible. The sight of a massive commercial jetliner embedded in one of the world's most famous buildings was a scene from a disaster movie, not the morning news. Inside the tower, above and below the point of impact, thousands of people were thrown into a state of chaos and terror. The collision severed elevator cables, destroyed stairwells, and filled hallways with thick, acrid smoke, trapping countless individuals on the upper floors. For those below the impact zone, a desperate evacuation began. They descended darkened stairwells, guided by emergency lights and the sheer will to survive, their journey down punctuated by the smell of jet fuel and the chilling sounds from above. Meanwhile, first responders began to converge on the scene, unaware that they were rushing towards a disaster of unprecedented magnitude. The initial commands were based on the assumption of a terrible, but contained, fire. The world watched, transfixed by the surreal images being broadcast globally. News helicopters circled the burning tower, providing a horrifyingly clear view of the devastation. The clean blue September sky was now scarred by a thick, ugly column of black smoke that was visible for miles. For 17 minutes the world grappled with the shock of a single horrific event. Commentators and officials speculated on the cause, but the idea of a deliberate act, a coordinated attack, was still too monstrous for most to fully entertain. The focus remained on the North Tower, a wounded giant bleeding smoke against the otherwise perfect morning. It was a moment of suspended disbelief, a collective pause before the second definitive act of terror. In those crucial minutes, the city's emergency services mounted a heroic, if ultimately doomed, response. Fire chiefs established a command post in the lobby of the North Tower, coordinating the ascent of firefighters who were burdened with heavy gear. They were heading into a structure fire unlike any ever seen before, fueled by thousands of gallons of jet fuel and raging at an impossible height. The bravery of these men and women, climbing towards the inferno while thousands fled in the opposite direction, would become one of the enduring legacies of the day. They were ascending into a building whose structural integrity was already fatally compromised, marching into the heart of a tragedy that was seconds away from escalating into a national cataclysm. At 9:03 a.m., as the world's attention was fixated on the burning North Tower, a second Boeing 767 appeared in the sky. United Airlines Flight 175, also from Boston, banked sharply and accelerated, flying improbably low over New York Harbor. On live television, millions watched in horror as the aircraft flew directly towards the South Tower of the World Trade Center. The impact was even more visceral and horrifying than the first, as the plane struck the tower between the 77th and 85th floors, erupting in a massive fiery explosion that sent debris raining down onto the streets below. In that single terrible moment, all doubt vanished. This was not an accident. This was a deliberate, coordinated attack on the United States. The second impact transformed the scene of a localized disaster into a declaration of war. The illusion of a tragic accident was shattered, replaced by the terrifying certainty of a malevolent and sophisticated enemy. For those on the ground and watching from afar, the second plane confirmed their worst fears. A wave of panic swept through lower Manhattan as the scale of the attack became horrifyingly clear. The event was no longer just a New York City emergency, it was a national security crisis of the highest order. The image of the second plane hitting the tower became the defining symbol of the day, a moment seared into the collective consciousness of a generation, replayed endlessly on screens around the globe. Inside the South Tower, the situation was dire. The plane's impact was lower than in the North Tower, meaning more people were trapped above. The building swayed violently, and those who had been hesitating to evacuate now scrambled for the exits. One stairwell, however, remained miraculously passable, allowing many on the upper floors a slim chance of escape. Their harrowing descent was a race against time, a journey through smoke-filled corridors and down crowded flights of stairs, all while the structure around them groaned under the immense strain of the fire. The decision to evacuate immediately after the first tower was hit undoubtedly saved thousands of lives in the South Tower. With both towers now burning, the iconic New York City skyline had become a tableau of destruction. The two columns of smoke merged into a single ominous cloud that blotted out the sun, casting a pall over the city. The Twin Towers, once symbols of American economic might and architectural ambition, were now transformed into colossal torches. The world watched, helpless and aghast, as the tragedy deepened with each passing minute. The question was no longer what had happened, but what would happen next. The nation held its breath, gripped by the chilling realization that the morning's horror might not yet be over. The twin symbols of American commerce were under assault, and the country felt vulnerable in a way it never had before. The scope of the September 11th plot extended far beyond New York City. At 9:37 a.m., less than 35 minutes after the second tower was struck, the attack reached the nation's capital. American Airlines Flight 77, a Boeing 757 that had taken off from Dulles International Airport, crashed into the western side of the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. The aircraft, loaded with fuel, created a devastating explosion and a fire that engulfed a section of the massive building. The headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense, the very symbol of American military power, was now a crime scene, burning under the same clear blue sky. The attack on the Pentagon confirmed that this was a meticulously planned assault aimed at the core symbols of American power, its economic, military, and political centers. The impact at the Pentagon caused a partial collapse of the building's outer rings, and ignited a fire that would burn for days. Military personnel and civilian employees suddenly found themselves in a war zone, scrambling through smoke and debris to escape the inferno and help their wounded colleagues. First responders from Arlington County and surrounding jurisdictions rushed to the scene, facing a complex and dangerous fire. The response was a mix of disciplined military procedure and civilian emergency services, all working together to save lives and contain the immense damage. The attack on the Pentagon brought the war home to the nation's military leadership in the most direct and brutal way imaginable. Meanwhile, a fourth hijacked plane, United Airlines Flight 93, was airborne and heading towards Washington, D.C. Having been delayed on the ground in Newark, the passengers and crew aboard this flight had a crucial advantage. They knew what had happened in New York and at the Pentagon through phone calls with loved ones and air traffic control. Realizing their plane was part of the same deadly plot, a group of passengers and crew made the courageous decision to fight back against the hijackers. Their struggle for control of the aircraft was a desperate act of defiance against unimaginable evil. Their now famous last words, like Todd Beamer's "Let's roll," became a rallying cry for a nation in shock. The heroic passenger revolt aboard Flight 93 prevented the hijackers from reaching their intended target, which is widely believed to have been either the U.S. Capitol or the White House. At 10:03 a.m., the plane crashed into an empty field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, at over 500 miles per hour. The aircraft was obliterated on impact, leaving behind a smoldering crater and scattered debris. The 40 passengers and crew members aboard sacrificed their own lives to save countless others and prevent an even greater catastrophe in the nation's capital. Their bravery provided a glimmer of light on an otherwise dark day, a powerful testament to the resilience and courage of ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances. Section 5. The Towers Fall. A Nation in Disbelief. The structural integrity of the World Trade Center towers, compromised by the intense heat of the jet fuel fires, was failing. At 9:59 a.m., after burning for 56 minutes, the South Tower began to collapse. To the horror of onlookers, the massive structure imploded, pancaking downwards floor by floor in a terrifying cascade of steel, concrete, and glass. A monstrous cloud of dust and debris, thick and dark, billowed out, engulfing all of Lower Manhattan. The sound was a deafening roar that drowned out the sirens and the screams, a visceral grinding noise that signaled the death of a landmark and the thousands still trapped inside. The sight was surreal, defying the laws of physics and imagination. For the first responders on the ground, the collapse was an apocalypse. Many were caught in the massive dust cloud which plunged the bright morning into pitch-black darkness. The air became unbreathable, filled with pulverized concrete, glass, and other toxic materials. Firefighters, police officers, and paramedics who had been working to save others were now fighting for their own survival, trying to outrun the rolling cloud of destruction or find shelter from the falling debris. The collapse of the South Tower dramatically escalated the crisis, turning a rescue operation into a desperate search for survivors amidst a mountain of rubble. It also sealed the fate of hundreds of rescuers who were inside or near the tower. As the world struggled to process the fall of the first tower, the unthinkable happened again. At 10:28 a.m., after burning for 102 minutes, the North Tower, the first to be hit, also collapsed. The process was sickeningly similar. A catastrophic structural failure leading to a complete and total implosion. Another colossal cloud of dust and debris surged through the streets of Lower Manhattan, compounding the destruction and deepening the sense of utter despair. The iconic Twin Towers, which had defined the New York City skyline for nearly 3 decades, were gone. In their place was a gaping void, both in the sky and in the heart of the nation. The fall of the towers marked the tragic culmination of the morning's attacks. It was a moment of profound national trauma, witnessed live by a global audience. The images of the collapses were seared into the collective memory, symbols of vulnerability and loss. On the ground, the area that would become known as Ground Zero was a scene of utter devastation, a hellish landscape of twisted steel and smoldering ruins stretching 16 acres. The hope of finding survivors in the towers was extinguished, replaced by the grim reality that the death toll would be immense. The day that had begun with a clear blue sky ended under a gray, toxic haze, with a nation and the world left to confront a new and terrifying reality. In the hours following the attacks, an eerie quiet fell over the United States, punctuated by the continuous wail of sirens in New York and Washington. For the first time in history, the Federal Aviation Administration ordered all civilian air traffic to be grounded. Thousands of planes were instructed to land at the nearest airport, leaving the skies over America empty and silent. This unprecedented move really underscored the gravity of the situation. The country was, for all intents and purposes, sealed off from the world and within its own borders. Bridges and tunnels leading into Manhattan were closed, financial markets ceased trading, and federal buildings across the country were evacuated. America was on lockdown, bracing itself for what might come next. In lower Manhattan, the dust began to settle, revealing a landscape of apocalyptic devastation. Streets were buried under several feet of ash and debris. Survivors emerged from the cloud, ghost-like figures caked in gray dust, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. A massive search and rescue operation began immediately, as firefighters, police officers, and construction workers converged on the smoldering pile at Ground Zero. For days and weeks they would toil relentlessly, digging through the twisted steel and concrete in a desperate and mostly futile search for survivors. This heroic effort, carried out under hazardous and emotionally draining conditions, became a powerful symbol of American resilience and solidarity. Across the nation and around the world, people were glued to their television screens, watching the horrifying images on a loop. The attacks elicited an outpouring of shock, sympathy, and solidarity from global leaders and ordinary citizens alike. Vigils were held from London to Sydney, and newspapers across the globe ran headlines like, "War on America." For a brief, powerful moment, the world seemed united in its grief and condemnation of the attacks. The phrase "Today, we are all Americans" echoed in capitals around the world, reflecting a shared sense of vulnerability and a common stand against the barbarity of terrorism. The global community collectively held its breath, waiting for America's response. In the evening, President George W. Bush addressed a stunned and grieving nation from the Oval Office. He sought to reassure the American people while promising retribution for the attacks. "Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings," he declared, "but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve." His words set the tone for what was to come, framing the events not just as a crime, but as an act of war. The speech marked a pivotal moment, signaling a shift from a nation in mourning to a nation preparing for a long and complex conflict against a new kind of enemy. President Bush's declaration that the United States would make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them laid the groundwork for a new, global conflict, the War on Terror. The immediate focus turned to Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization led by Osama bin Laden, which was quickly identified as the perpetrator of the attacks. The Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which had provided sanctuary for bin Laden and his training camps, was given an ultimatum: hand over the Al-Qaeda leaders, or share in their fate. The Taliban's refusal to comply set the stage for military intervention, marking the first major campaign in this new and unconventional war. On October 7, 2001, less than a month after the 9/11 attacks, the United States, supported by an international coalition, launched Operation Enduring Freedom. The military campaign began with a series of airstrikes against Taliban and Al-Qaeda targets in Afghanistan. The stated goals were to dismantle the terrorist network, capture or kill its leaders, and remove the Taliban from power. This swift and decisive military response had broad public support in the United States, as a wounded nation sought justice and security. The invasion of Afghanistan represented a fundamental shift in U.S. foreign policy, one that would prioritize counterterrorism and preemptive action on a global scale. The War on Terror was not confined to the battlefields of Afghanistan. Domestically, the U.S. government enacted sweeping changes to its security and intelligence apparatus. The Department of Homeland Security was created, consolidating 22 federal agencies into a single cabinet-level department tasked with protecting the nation from future attacks. The Patriot Act was passed, granting the government broad new powers of surveillance and investigation in the name of national security. These measures, while intended to prevent another 9/11, sparked a fierce and ongoing debate about the balance between security and civil liberties, a debate that continues to this day, 24 years later. The hunt for Osama bin Laden became the central focus of the War on Terror. For nearly a decade, the Al-Qaeda leader eluded capture, becoming a phantom-like figure taunting the world's most powerful military. His eventual discovery and killing by U.S. Navy SEALs in a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, in May 2011, was a major symbolic victory. It brought a sense of closure to many, especially the families of 9/11 victims. However, the war he had started did not end with his death. The conflict had already expanded into Iraq, and had given rise to new offshoots and ideologies, ensuring that the global struggle against terrorism would continue long after its original architect was gone. The aftermath of September 11th ushered in a new era defined by heightened security measures that have become a permanent fixture of modern life. Air travel, once a relatively simple process, was transformed overnight. Reinforced cockpit doors, federal air marshals, and rigorous passenger screening became standard. The creation of the Transportation Security Administration introduced new protocols, from removing shoes and limiting liquids to full-body scans. While these measures were designed to prevent another hijacking, they also symbolized a broader societal shift, the loss of a certain innocence and the acceptance of pervasive security as a necessary inconvenience in a post-9/11 world, a reality we still live with in 2025. Beyond the airports, the attacks fostered a climate of fear and suspicion that permeated many aspects of society. The threat of terrorism became a constant, low-level hum in the background of daily life, amplified by color-coded threat advisories and news reports of foiled plots. This atmosphere had profound social consequences, particularly for Muslim and Arab communities in the United States and across the Western world. They faced increased scrutiny, prejudice, and discrimination, as the actions of a few extremists were unjustly projected onto an entire faith. Mosques were vandalized, and individuals were targeted in hate crimes, creating deep divisions and challenging the very fabric of multicultural societies. The legal and ethical landscape was also dramatically altered. In the pursuit of terrorists, the Bush administration adopted controversial policies, including the establishment of the Guantanamo Bay detention camp. This facility, located on a U.S. naval base in Cuba, was set up to hold and interrogate suspected enemy combatants outside the jurisdiction of U.S. federal courts. The use of enhanced interrogation techniques and the indefinite detention of individuals without trial sparked international condemnation and a fierce debate within the United States about its commitment to human rights and the rule of law. The legacy of Guantanamo remains a contentious issue, a stark reminder of the difficult compromises made in the name of security. Globally, the war on terror reshaped international relations and alliances. The U.S. doctrine of preemption, most notably applied in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, strained relationships with longtime allies and fueled anti-American sentiment in many parts of the world. The conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq proved to be long, costly, and complex, with consequences that continue to destabilize the Middle East. The attacks of 9/11 did not just lead to a war on Al-Qaeda, they became the catalyst for a series of interventions and geopolitical shifts that have redrawn the map of global politics, creating new conflicts and challenges that persist into the present day. Become embedded in the machinery of government, fundamentally altering the relationship between the state and its citizens. the geopolitical landscape remains turbulent, with new threats and conflicts having emerged from the vacuums and grievances left by the War on Terror. The world of 2025 is, in countless ways, a direct product of the events of September 11, 2001. Reflecting on that day from the vantage point of 24 years, its significance becomes ever clearer. It was a day of immense tragedy and unimaginable loss, but it was also a day of extraordinary heroism and unity. It exposed the nation's vulnerabilities but also revealed its deepest strengths. The stories of the passengers on Flight 93, of the first responders who charged into burning buildings, and of ordinary people helping one another on the streets, remain powerful testaments to the human capacity for courage and compassion in the face of hatred. September 11th did not just change the world, it revealed essential truths about it, truths we are still grappling with today. It remains a day to remember, to mourn, and to learn from, forever etched in the annals of history.